this idea of religion being brought up in many different areas and it making sense that people have religion in their societies, does bring up the question of, does religion impact morality? And I know both of you have extensive studies on morality. You know, Dr. Machery, your work in moral psychology and the ethical significance of cognition, and Dr. Hare, you've written about the question of goodness in your book, The Moral Gap, and asking the question, why bother being good? And so when it comes to approaching the question of morality, how do you define good? Is God necessary for goodness to exist? Or is goodness something that religion provides rather than a divine being?
Okay, I'll start this one. But I'll start by not answering the question. I apologize. I'll start by giving you a little bit of background about my way of thinking about morality. And I've got two hats when I'm thinking about morality. I've got a philosophical hat, and I've got a more empirical hat, because I also do some empirical work. As a philosopher, I'm mostly interested in what it is we mean when we say things like, it's wrong to lie, you should not lie, you should not kill. What do we mean when we use these kind of statements? I'm also interested in the justification that we have for holding this view. Are we ever justified in believing that it's wrong to lie? It's a part of philosophy that philosophers call metaethics. This is really where my interests lie. And in this area of philosophy, I have a very somewhat unusual view called norm expressivism. So let me explain to you, it's a bit of jargon. Let me explain to you what that means. It means that when I say it is wrong to lie, I'm not describing the world around me. It's very different from, lying is wrong. I'm not describing the world. It's very different from saying this jacket is gray, where I'm describing the jacket, right? When I say lying is wrong, what I'm really telling you is that I'm expressing a negative attitude toward lying, and I'm recommending that you also have a similar attitude. So I'm prescribing a given way of relating to lying. So that's my view. In fact, we believe we are saying some things about the world when we're saying lying is wrong, that there's wrongness in the world, that we can learn about wrongness, but it's an illusion. What there really is attitudes that people have with respect to various actions, such as lying. And sometimes we are confusing lying is wrong with statements such as my jacket is gray. An interesting wrinkle, if you're a norm expressivist, is that you can be a relativist. You can think that attitudes vary across cultures, for example, and you can find that totally okay, right? You can find that it's totally fine if the norms people are committed to vary in different cultures, in different settings, and so on and so forth. On this view, being good is not a matter of objective fact, right? There's no objective things to learn about the world, about goodness. Goodness is defined by the attitude that some group of people happen to have with respect to some action, all right? So that's my philosophical hat. I suspect very different from John's philosophical hat, but we're going to hear about that. I also have an empirical hat, where I do some empirical work on morality. And one of the things I'm interested in, that ties a little bit with my philosophical perspective, is how do we distinguish morality from other things in life? You know, so for example, you say, it's wrong to jaywalk. When I teach my daughter, I tell her, you should look right and left before crossing a street. When I was a kid, as you can hear, I'm French, right? I guess you've all got that. And if you know a bit France, for a very long time, French people are sticklers for rules. They love etiquette. It's very important to behave properly, right? So when I was a child, my mother was telling me, you ought to put your two hands around the table when we're eating and when you're not putting food in your mouth. It's very wrong not to have your hands on your knees. Now, there's all these statements we make, right? What do they have in common? They're all normative. They use words such as should, ought, right, wrong, right? One question that interests me is that, is there anything specific about morality among these statements? Is there something that distinguishes it is wrong to lie from you ought not to jaywalk, from you ought to put your hands around the table? Right? These are not moral statements. I guess you agree. They're etiquette statements. They're conventional statements, right? But what distinguishes all these kinds of statements? And in some empirical work I've done, I've tried to provide evidence that in many cultures around the world, morality is not distinguished from these other statements. You can't really identify anything like a moral statement that differs from other types of statement, which has led me to the view that moral statement as moral are in fact an invention of a given culture or culture, and it's not a universal aspect of the human mind. And that ties a little bit with my philosophical views, because what really matters is not so much morality, it's the expression of your norms, what you believe you ought to do.
Yes, I'm delighted that you're a norm expressivist. My father actually invented norm expressivism.
Indeed. So I didn't know he was your father, yes. But indeed I knew. This is quite amazing.
so I'm very familiar with this discussion. R.M. Hare, my father, if asked what makes moral norms different from other norms, like etiquette, he would say, like other norms, they're prescriptive and universalizable, but unlike the other norms, they're overriding. So that's what makes moral norms different from the other norms. And then we have to specify just what overriding means. I myself disagree with my father on the question of whether norms are real, whether there is something objective in the world that our moral judgments express. So I'm what I call a prescriptive realist. So you can combine the view that we are prescribing when we make a moral judgment with the view that there is something actually there that we are trying to express. That's enough.
I'll confess, I'm in awe at this one. Yeah.
Well, this is so interesting about just the difference between morality and etiquette. And could you both kind of give examples of, I know you already shared the etiquette of French culture, but ways in which perhaps morality or things we consider moral concepts override or not override etiquette?
Yes, so the rules in my family were you had to keep your hands off the table unless you were an uncle or aunt when you could put your hands on the table. And if you were a great uncle or great aunt, you could put your feet on the table. Why is morality overriding? Well, if you have to judge whether, let's say, an aesthetic norm, my father's example was, you shouldn't put magenta cushions on an orange sofa. but your aunt who gave you the cushion is coming and cares very much. You override the aesthetic preference for the sake of the moral one. And the claim that morality overrides is that that's usually the case. Not, I think, always, but usually.
Then perhaps we can go back to the question: is God necessary for goodness to exist? And I think that is kind of a loaded question, in that is morality above humans or below humans? And I'm curious what you both have to say about that.
So as a non-believer, I will tell you, unsurprisingly, that the answer is no, that you can be a good person, you can strive to be a good person, even if there is no God. I would hope so, because I believe there's no God and I'm striving to be a good person. So I hope I'm not completely deluded on this point. For me, bracketing a little bit my norm expressivism for a minute. Let's suppose that you and I, which is quite likely, I suspect, agree by and large on many things that it means to be a good person. Right? We live in the same culture. We have overlapping backgrounds, not the same, of course, but there's probably a lot of agreement between us on what it means to be a good person. So how could you become a good person? Would a belief in God, or would God be necessary for striving to be a good person? I do believe that, and I suspect John will agree about that character is a very important aspect for being a good person. You know, Aristotle, of course, thought a lot about character as an important dimension of goodness. Another aspect, and I'm not sure that John would agree about that, is your environment. So I do believe that to be a good person, you need to be in the right environment. While I believe that character matters, I also believe that character cannot override the situations we happen to be thrown in. And often if people with the right character might be led to act wrongly because of the situations we're in. And I think that matters extremely, because we tend to focus on what's inside the character while forgetting the fact that we are embedded in a social environment. And that often the way to promote goodness is less to work on ourselves than to work in the environments we're in, to engineer good environment where people can actually fulfill their promises rather than just relying on who they are. Also, sometimes it means we should move environment rather to try to change the environment we're in. We should just look for environment in which we can actually be successful. And the last thing about environments, something that matters a lot for my way of thinking about life, is luck. It's sadly often a matter of luck whether we are in the right environment. So whether we're going to end up being a good person is often just a matter of luck, where we're lucky to be in the right environment that has allowed us to act in the right way. And I think that's an interesting puzzle if you are a moral philosopher. One that's not new, obviously. Philosophers have written a lot about that question. But if you haven't thought about it, think about how luck might matter in making you a good or a bad person, and how little maybe depends on what you're responsible for, what you have control over.
Yes. So there are a number of points there. Luck. So I told you I've done a lot of work on Immanuel Kant. I think he's the most important philosopher of the modern age. He responds to this point about luck by saying that your circumstances never dictate what kind of person you are. We always have the freedom to respond well to bad circumstances. And he thinks that actually morality requires us to think of each other that way. The way he puts it is, morality requires each of us to think of each other person as capable of virtue. So he acknowledges that there are lots of good people, not just striving to be good, but actually good, who don't believe in God. His central example is Spinoza, which might be unfair to Spinoza. but he thought of Spinoza as a famously good person, but somebody who didn't believe in God. So he's not saying you have to be a believer in order to be morally good. What he's saying is, this is his phrase, it's rationally unstable to combine these two things, that is, unbelief and the attempt to lead a morally good life. And it's rationally unstable because of those three reasons that I started with at the very beginning of this discussion.
I do have a question about that because the two bottom points were we often prefer ourselves over good, and then there's also the question of why should we be good? Could you expand more on those points?
Yes. So here's Kant again. He says we're born with both the predisposition to good and the propensity to evil. Both of those are innate. But there's a difference between them, he says. The predisposition to good is essential to us. And if we lost it, we wouldn't, in fact, be human any longer. The propensity to evil is something we can lose. And in fact, hopefully some of us do lose it. So the propensity to evil is the propensity to put our own happiness above everything else, including our moral duty. So we'll only do what we think is the right thing to do if we think it'll make us happy. And Kant thinks we're born with that. But it can be overcome. It has to be possible to overcome because we ought to overcome it. And Kant has the principle, ought implies can. If it's the case that we ought to do it, then it must be the case that we can do it. It's wrong to hold people accountable to standards which they are unable to meet. So it must be possible, but it doesn't seem to be possible by our own devices. Because to overcome it by our own devices would require that we weren't already within radical evil, which he thinks we are. So that's why he says we need God. We need divine assistance to help us overcome this tendency. That's the second one. And then the third one, justification. We need justification because morality is very difficult. So let me just give you two examples of that. One is morality requires us to love our enemies. That's almost impossible. And then secondly, this is from Peter Singer, who was my father's student. But he says we have an obligation to help, use our resources to help those who are starving in the rest of the world. And that requires us to reduce our own standard of living. And he actually has done that. I mean, he's somebody who does practice what he preaches. But it's very difficult. And my point is, if we're going to do it, we need some justification for doing it in those cases where it seems to conflict with all of our inclinations.
So I'll follow up. I think that's, of course, extremely interesting. I want to point out the fact that Kant's claims rest on what Kant himself called, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, an anthropology. Right? He's making claim about human nature, namely the incredible power of our egoistic tendencies, namely, and so on and so forth. these are empirical claims. These claims about who we are. They're not philosophical claims. They're not metaphysical claims. They're claims that anthropology, evolutionary biology, psychology can validate or invalidate. So, for example, when it comes to human being, well, of course, Kant does recognize that there is both good and bad in us, so to speak. One might think that, in fact, there's much more good than bad in us. One might think that a dominant, well, of course, we can sometimes prefer our own interests to other people. Very often, we do, without much difficulty, the exact opposite. That actually, being good comes very easily to most of us, right? And I do think that's a very different anthropology about the nature about human nature. One that, if we take seriously, somewhat undermines the kind of consideration that Kant puts forward. Another point also I wanted to make is, John is quite right to say it's extremely hard to do what Peter Singer says. It's extremely hard to love your enemies. And indeed, it's very hard to be a moral saint. But I think it's very easy to be a morally good person. Moral saints are very rare. In fact, moral saints are not necessarily the people I want to hang out with. I think there's a lot of problematic things with moral saints. In fact, most of us are actually, on our everyday dealing, really good people. We don't go around kicking one another. We don't go around stealing one another. We don't go around lying to one another. We sometimes lie. We feel bad about it. We sometimes might pocket the change or might not give it back. We feel bad about it. But in most of our dealings, we are actually good people. So everyday morality is actually widespread and quite easy. I think it's a mistake to just focus on moral sainthood of the Peter Singer version. Give pretty much all your income to charities. You can do that if you want, it's great. But I think this is not capturing the way we are actually good on an everyday basis. And I think when you have a different anthropology, the need for God is quite lessened.
Dr. Machery, I'm very curious on that point, that you say that morality comes very naturally to most people, or goodness. You mentioned before that there is a big part of luck in how we were brought up, in how we define good in our lives. So how would you come to terms with the luck factor in the ease of being good?
That's a very good question. The two are, of course, compatible. If you're unlucky, and if you were unlucky, and if you were born in the 1920s in Germany, to use a classical philosophical example, you might have grown up being an anti-Semitic Nazi. And what would come easily to you or to me would then be hatred of millions of Europeans, leading you to behave in an appalling manner, right? In that case, luck would have led you to easily do the things that are wrong. It turns out that by luck, we are not, many of us are not in this kind of environment. And so what comes easily to us is actually somewhat different from what would come easily to us in this environment. Which is why I think paying attention to the environment we live in, as a social structure, what is valued around us, engineering better environment, more in line, and choosing the environment we live is extremely important.
Yes, I think maybe we just have a fundamental disagreement about how good we are. To me, it seems that it's self-congratulatory to think that we're all good, basically good people. We all have good in us, that is true. But if if the moral standard is, to put this in Kant's terms now, we have to share the ends of the people who are affected by what we do. We have to make them our own ends. Then we're failing by that standard most of the time. And we don't have to be saints in order to have those standards. I think they're in the culture. And I think we are, in fact, most of us aware of the fact, deep down, that we're not meeting those standards.
So earlier we met an interesting line was that two of us disagree about explaining a belief in God and the place of science. And I think John is right here. We meet another point where there's maybe a source of a deep disagreement is whether or not how difficult it is to behave in a moral manner. John is more pessimistic in this way, as was Kant. And I believe I'm more optimistic, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks.